They said he built it wrong on purpose, like a man who had forgotten how the world was supposed to stand, but no one noticed the way the wind curved around that cabin without ever touching it. Before we begin, tell me this. Have you ever seen something that looked broken and later realized it was the only thing that could survive? The road into Pine Hollow bent quietly through miles of dry earth and pale grass, where mailboxes leaned like tired sentries, and the air carried the faint scent of cedar and dust, and at the far edge of that forgotten stretch stood a cabin that didn't belong. It wasn't straight, not like the others, not like the clean, sharp-edged homes that lined the newer side of the valley with their polished decks and perfect symmetry. This one curved, subtly, almost like it had breathed in and never fully exhaled. Its wooden frame arched just enough to make people uncomfortable without knowing why. They laughed about it at first. "Looks like it's about to fall over," one man said, standing with a cup of coffee on his pristine porch, watching from a safe distance. His neighbor chuckled. Or like the guy who built it didn't know what he was doing. And maybe that was the point. Because the man who lived there, Daniel Hayes, a former U.S. Marine, never corrected them. Never explained. He kept to himself, moving with a quiet steadiness that felt out of place in a town that measured worth by appearances. His hair had gone lighter at the temples, not from age alone, but from something deeper, something carried back from places no one here had ever seen. His hands were rough, deliberate, always building, always adjusting something on that strange cabin as if listening to a blueprint no one else could hear. And always, at his side, was Rex. A German shepherd with a sable coat that caught the sun in muted gold and black, his amber eyes scanning everything, not with fear, but with memory. Rex didn't bark much, didn't chase. He watched, especially the ground beneath the cabin. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light turned soft and long shadows stretched across the dirt, Rex would sit at the base of the structure and tilt his head slightly, ears twitching at something buried too deep for human ears. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. But he never said a word. The neighbors noticed too, though not in the same way. To them, it was just another reason to shake their heads. "That dog's as strange as the house," a woman muttered once, pulling her coat tighter as she walked past with her groceries. Figures. They didn't see the way Rex positioned himself at night, always facing outward, always between Daniel and the dark. They didn't see the way Daniel sometimes paused mid-step, listening to the wind not as noise, but as a warning. They saw what was easy. A crooked cabin, a quiet man, a dog that didn't act right. And in Pine Hollow, easy was enough to decide what mattered. On certain mornings, when the sky hung low and gray and the air felt heavier than it should, Daniel would stand just outside the cabin door, one hand resting lightly on the curved frame, his eyes scanning the distant hills where the newer houses gleamed under fresh paint and wide windows. He didn't envy them. Not really. But there was something in his gaze that lingered a second too long, like a man remembering a map he wished others could see. Behind him, Rex would rise silently, step forward, and press his shoulder against Daniel's leg. Just enough to ground him. Just enough to remind him where he was. And Daniel would nod once, almost to himself, as if answering a question no one had asked. The wind would shift. The trees would whisper. And somewhere beneath the cabin, something unseen would settle, waiting. The first crack did not sound like anything important, just a soft shift beneath the earth, like dry soil settling after a long day of heat. But Rex heard it before the wind carried it, before the trees whispered it, before anyone else in Pine Hollow had reason to pause, and his head lifted sharply, ears forward, body still in that quiet, alert posture that meant something was not right. Daniel noticed the change immediately, the way a man notices when silence turns into something else, something heavier, and he followed the dog's gaze toward the far ridge where the newer homes stood in clean rows, their white siding catching the afternoon light like polished bone. Everything looked normal. Too normal. A pickup truck rolled slowly down the paved road, tires humming softly, a lawn sprinkler ticked in steady rhythm, and somewhere, in the distance, laughter drifted from a backyard where neighbors gathered around a fire pit, unaware that the ground beneath them had begun to shift in ways they could not see. Daniel stepped off the porch, boots pressing into the dry dirt with a weight that carried memory, and he walked toward the edge of the cabin where Rex now stood, staring at a patch of earth that looked no different from any other. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, his voice low, steady, the kind of tone that did not expect an answer but trusted the silence that followed. Rex did not bark. He never did in moments like this. Instead, he lowered his head and placed one paw gently against the ground, as if marking something invisible, then looked back at Daniel with eyes that held a warning too old to ignore. The air shifted. It was subtle at first, just a change in the way the breeze moved through the trees, no longer flowing clean and open but curling slightly, bending around the cabin in that same unnatural arc that had always made people uneasy. Daniel felt it along his skin, that faint tightening, like pressure building before a storm that had not yet formed. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon again, and this time he saw it, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, the way a man who had lived through collapse learns to read the world in quiet signs. A flicker in the distance. Not light, not quite movement, but something unsettled. Behind him, the cabin creaked softly, not from weakness, but from adjustment, wood shifting into place as if responding to a force no one else could feel. Daniel reached out and rested his hand against the curved frame, feeling the structure beneath his palm, solid, grounded, alive in a way straight lines never were. He had built it that way for a reason. Not because he did not understand how to make things level, but because he understood what happened when the ground beneath you refused to stay still. A memory flickered behind his eyes, dim and distant, of a place where walls had once stood straight until they did not, where the difference between standing and falling had come down to a single decision made in silence. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and looked down at Rex again. "You hear it too," he murmured. Rex's tail remained still, his focus unbroken, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them and the ground beneath their feet. Across the valley, a car door slammed. Someone called out. Cheerful, careless, the kind of voice that had never needed to listen for anything beyond itself. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. They would not hear it. Not yet. The second shift came a few minutes later, just enough to make a hanging wind chime tremble where it stood on a neighbor's porch, its soft metallic notes drifting unevenly through the air. A woman glanced at it from her kitchen window, frowned for a second, then turned back to her phone. The sprinkler continued its steady ticking. The laughter returned. Life, uninterrupted. But beneath it all, something was changing. Daniel stepped back onto the porch, his movements deliberate now, measured, and he glanced once more toward the ridge before turning to the door. Rex followed close, not out of habit, but out of purpose, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg as if urging him forward. Inside, the cabin felt different, not warmer, not colder, but prepared. The curved walls held the air in a way that muted the outside noise, bending sound just as they bent wind, and for a moment everything settled into a quiet that felt almost sacred. Daniel paused in the center of the room, listening, not for what was loud, but for what was missing. Then he nodded once, a small, almost invisible gesture, and reached for the old lantern hanging by the door. Not because the lights were out, not yet, but because some habits are not about reaction. They are about knowing when something has already begun. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridge, the sky had taken on a color that did not belong to evening, a pale, strained gray that pressed down instead of fading out, and even the birds seemed to hesitate before crossing it, their wings cutting through the air with a caution that did not go unnoticed by the one man in Pine Hollow who still remembered what unease felt like before it became disaster. Daniel Hayes stood just inside the doorway, the lantern now resting in his hand though it had not yet been lit, and Rex remained close, pacing once along the curved wall before settling again near the same spot in the floor where he had listened earlier, his ears twitching at intervals too precise to ignore. Outside, the world still moved as if nothing had changed, but the rhythm was off, subtle at first, like a song played slightly out of tune, and Daniel could feel it in the way the air pressed against his chest when he stepped back onto the porch. Across the valley, one of the larger houses flickered with movement as a set of outdoor lights blinked on earlier than usual, their bright white glow cutting sharply through the dimming haze, and a man stepped out onto his deck, phone in hand, scanning the sky with a confused frown. Daniel recognized him, a man named Carter Blake, the kind who measured life in square footage and clean lines, who had once laughed openly at the cabin's curved walls, calling it a mistake that somehow still stood. Carter raised his phone, likely recording the strange sky, turning slowly as if trying to capture something worth sharing. But there are moments that do not belong on screens, moments that demand attention instead of distance, and this was one of them. The wind shifted again, stronger this time, but not wild, not yet, just insistent, pushing against the valley in uneven currents that bent around structures differently, sliding past Daniel's cabin in a smooth arc while catching sharply against the straight edges of the newer homes, rattling shutters, tugging at loose fixtures, testing every line that had been built to remain rigid. Rex rose without a sound, moving to Daniel's side, his body pressed close, and together they watched as a patio umbrella across the way snapped open despite being tied down, its fabric straining against the sudden pressure before twisting awkwardly, as if the air itself had changed direction mid-breath. A second later, the lights in Carter's house flickered once, twice, then steadied. But the pause had been long enough to register, long enough to plant something deeper than confusion. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady, and for a moment his mind drifted to a place where hesitation had once cost seconds that could not be recovered, where structures had failed not because they were weak, but because they were built without understanding what the ground beneath them could become. He turned back inside, setting the lantern carefully on the table, and reached for a small, worn radio sitting near the wall, the kind that did not rely on signals that could vanish without warning. Static greeted him at first, low and uneven, but beneath it there was a voice, distant, strained, repeating something about shifting conditions, about unexpected ground movement along the ridge, about caution, always caution, as if the word itself could hold back what was coming. Outside, a car engine revved abruptly, tires crunching over gravel as someone decided it was time to leave. But there are moments when leaving is no longer the safest choice, only the most instinctive one. Daniel stepped back to the doorway, his eyes tracking the movement as a sleek sedan rolled down the road, its headlights cutting through the thickening haze, and for a second it seemed like everything might remain contained, manageable, something that could still be outrun. Then the ground gave a subtle, undeniable shift, not a jolt, not enough to throw anything off balance, but enough to make the car hesitate, its motion faltering just slightly before continuing forward. Carter Blake had stopped recording now, his phone lowered, his posture no longer casual, and he glanced toward Daniel's cabin for the briefest moment, as if seeing it differently for the first time, though he could not yet understand why. The wind carried a new sound then, low and distant, like something deep within the earth adjusting itself in slow, deliberate movement, and Rex's head snapped toward the ridge, his body going still in that same focused alertness that had never once been wrong. Daniel followed his gaze, and this time he did not search for what was visible, but for what was inevitable, the quiet realization settling in his chest with a weight that felt familiar, unwelcome, but clear. He stepped fully outside, leaving the door open behind him, the lantern still unlit on the table, because light was not what mattered yet. Preparation was. And as the sky darkened not with night, but with something heavier, something closer, Daniel Hayes stood beside his dog and watched a world that had once seemed stable begin, slowly and without warning, to prove otherwise. The moment it began, it did not arrive with noise, but with absence, the kind that steals the small, familiar sounds first, until even the wind seems to hold its breath, and Daniel felt it before he heard anything at all, a pressure in the air that pressed low against the valley, heavy and deliberate, as if something vast had shifted just beyond sight and was now settling into place. Rex moved first, stepping forward onto the porch with a sudden urgency, his body aligned toward the ridge, muscles taut but controlled, not panicked, never panicked, and that alone was enough for Daniel to understand that whatever was coming had already crossed a line that could not be undone. The ground responded next, not violently, not with chaos, but with a slow, undeniable roll beneath his boots, like the earth itself exhaling after holding something in for too long. And across the valley, lights flickered again, this time longer, this time uncertain. A distant voice carried faintly through the air, someone calling out, not in fear yet, but in confusion, the tone of a person who had just realized something was not right, but had not yet decided what that meant. Daniel did not move toward the road, did not call out, did not react the way others might have, because reaction belonged to those who still believed there would be time to figure things out. He turned instead, stepping back inside the cabin with measured precision, his hand brushing once along the curved wall, as if confirming something only he understood, and Rex followed immediately, pausing only once at the threshold to glance back at the darkening valley before slipping inside. The door remained open, not out of carelessness, but because closing it now would mean choosing separation, and Daniel was not ready to make that choice yet. Inside, the air held steady, unchanged, the curved structure absorbing the subtle shifts outside, redistributing them, holding its ground in a way straight lines never could. Daniel crossed the room and knelt beside the section of floor where Rex had listened earlier, his fingers tracing the edge of a wooden panel that looked no different from the rest until he pressed it lightly and felt the give beneath, the hidden seam revealing itself with a quiet click. The panel lifted with practiced ease, revealing a narrow opening below, a space built not for comfort, but for survival, reinforced beams curving downward in the same arch that defined the cabin above, forming a chamber designed to move with the earth instead of against it. Rex leaned forward, peering into the darkness, then stepped back as if acknowledging what was already known. Outside, the sounds began to change, no longer scattered or distant, but layered, overlapping, the uneven rhythm of a place losing its sense of stability. A car horn sounded briefly, then cut off. Something metallic clattered, followed by voices rising, sharper now, edged with the first traces of fear. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, not to escape it, but to listen more clearly, and in that moment, the past did not return as images, but as instinct, the quiet, undeniable knowledge of what came next when structures failed, and people realized too late that the ground beneath them was no longer reliable. He opened his eyes and stood, moving quickly now, but without panic, setting the lantern on the edge of the opening, striking a match and lighting it with steady hands, the soft glow filling the space below with a warm, contained light that did not flicker despite the shifting air outside. Rex moved to his side again, pressing close, his presence not just comfort, but confirmation. Then came the sound that changed everything, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no room for doubt. A deep, low shift that traveled through the ground and into the bones, and across the valley. One of the newer homes tilted just slightly, enough to send a ripple of movement through the structure, enough for a window to catch the light at the wrong angle, enough for someone to shout, this time unmistakably, this time with fear fully formed. Daniel stepped back toward the doorway, his gaze fixed on the ridge, and for the first time since the day began, the illusion of control broke across Pine Hollow, not in destruction, but in realization, the quiet understanding that what had been trusted to stand might not hold after all. Figures moved now, small at first, then clearer as they stepped into open view. People leaving their homes, looking around, calling to one another, their voices rising into the thickening air that carried no answers back. Carter Blake stood at the edge of his property, his phone forgotten at his side, his expression no longer confused but searching, scanning the valley as if trying to find something solid to hold onto, and for a brief second, his eyes landed on the one structure that had not shifted, not creaked, not faltered. The curved cabin. Daniel met that look without expression, not with pride, not with vindication, but with the quiet weight of knowing what came next, because the moment had arrived, the one where understanding begins to replace certainty, where those who once stood apart would soon have no choice but to move closer. Behind him, the lantern burned steadily, the opening in the floor waiting, and beside him, Rex stood still as stone, eyes forward, ready, as the valley crossed the threshold from doubt into need. The first knock did not come from panic, but from hesitation, a single, uncertain sound against the quiet tension that now filled the air, and Daniel did not turn immediately, because he already knew who it would be before the second knock followed, firmer this time, carrying the weight of someone who had run out of options faster than expected. Rex moved first, stepping toward the doorway, not aggressive, not defensive, but aware, his body positioned between Daniel and whatever stood outside, and when Daniel finally turned, his expression remained unchanged, calm in a way that felt almost distant, as if he had already stepped beyond the moment everyone else was just beginning to face. Carter Blake stood on the porch, no longer the composed man from earlier, his shirt slightly disheveled, his breath uneven, eyes searching not for answers, but for permission. For a second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them in a way that carried more truth than words ever could. Behind Carter, the valley had shifted into something unrecognizable, not destroyed, not yet, but unsettled, the ground no longer trusted, the structures no longer certain, and figures moved in the distance with growing urgency, people calling out, gathering, their voices overlapping in confusion that had begun to harden into fear. Carter swallowed, his voice catching once before finding its way out. "Daniel, something is wrong," he said, the words simple, but stripped of the confidence they once carried. Daniel looked at him for a long second, not unkind, not cold, just steady, and in that look was the quiet reflection of everything Carter had failed to see before. "I know," Daniel replied, his voice low, even, the kind of tone that did not rise to meet panic, but absorbed it instead. Carter glanced past him, his eyes landing on the interior of the cabin, on the curved walls, the steady lantern light, the strange stillness that seemed untouched by the shifting world outside, and something in his posture changed, subtle but undeniable, the first break in the certainty he had once worn so easily. "My house, it is not." He stopped, searching for the right word, but there was none that fit what he was trying to say, none that captured the feeling of something built to last beginning to betray that promise. "It is not stable," he finished finally, the word falling flat against the truth behind it. Rex's ears flicked once, his gaze shifting briefly toward the valley as another distant shout carried through the air, sharper now, more urgent, and Daniel followed that sound for just a second before returning his attention to the man in front of him. "No," Daniel said quietly. "It is not." The ground shifted again, slightly stronger this time, enough to make Carter glance back over his shoulder, his body instinctively tensing, and in that moment, the difference between the two men became clear, one reacting, the other already prepared. Carter turned back quickly, something close to desperation now breaking through the last of his restraint. "I need," he began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat as pride, habit, and reality collided all at once. He looked down briefly, then back up, and when he spoke again, the change was complete. "Please," he said, the single word carrying more weight than anything he had said all day. Behind him, more figures were approaching now, neighbors who had once stood at a distance, their movements hesitant but directed, drawn toward the one place that had not shifted, not faltered, not betrayed them. A woman clutched her jacket tightly around her, her eyes wide as she looked between the ground and the cabin, a child close at her side, silent in a way children rarely are unless they understand something without needing it explained. Daniel's gaze moved past Carter to take in the others, the way they gathered just beyond the porch, uncertain, waiting, and for a moment, time seemed to slow, the weight of the decision settling into the space between breath and action. Rex leaned lightly against Daniel's leg, the contact brief but deliberate, and Daniel closed his eyes for just a second, not in hesitation, but in memory, a voice from somewhere far behind the present rising quietly, steady, familiar. "We do not leave people behind." His eyes opened again, and whatever distance had been there before was gone, replaced by something quieter, something resolved. He stepped back from the doorway, the movement small but unmistakable, creating space where there had been none. "Come inside," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough, and for a moment, no one moved, as if they needed to hear it again to believe it. Then Carter stepped forward first, slow, careful, crossing the threshold with a kind of reverence that had not been there before, and the others followed, one by one, their footsteps cautious against the wooden floor, their eyes taking in the curved walls, the steady light, the sense of something built not for show, but for survival. Rex remained near the entrance, watching each person as they passed, not judging, not welcoming, simply aware, and Daniel stood just inside, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet, as the space he had built for himself became something more, something shared, not because it had to be, but because he chose it to be. Inside the cabin, The air shifted in a different way than outside, not tense, not uncertain, but contained, as if the curved walls had learned how to hold fear without letting it spread. And for the first time since the ground had begun to move, the voices softened, not because the danger had passed, but because something here refused to let it grow. Carter Blake stood just a few steps in, his eyes moving slowly across the structure, tracing the arc of the beams, the way the ceiling curved instead of pressing down, the way the lantern light settled evenly instead of flickering. And for a man who had always trusted straight lines, there was something deeply unsettling about how stable this place felt. Behind him, others gathered close, their shoulders nearly touching, not out of comfort, but instinct, as if proximity might anchor them to something solid. And a child clung quietly to his mother's hand, his gaze fixed on Rex, who stood near the entrance like a silent guard, his presence steady, grounding, real. Daniel moved without hurry, but with purpose, stepping past them toward the center of the room, where the wooden panel remained open, the warm glow of the lantern casting soft light down into the space below. "We go down," he said, his voice calm, not raised, but carrying through the room with a clarity that did not invite question. Carter turned toward him, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face again. "Down?" he asked, glancing toward the opening, then back at Daniel, as if expecting more explanation, something technical, something that would make sense in the way he was used to. Daniel did not elaborate. He simply nodded once. "It is safer." Another subtle shift passed through the ground, slightly stronger this time, enough to make a glass on the table tremble, its soft clink echoing louder than it should have, and that was enough to end the hesitation. One by one, they moved toward the opening, slower at first, uncertain, until the woman with the child stepped forward, lowering herself carefully onto the wooden steps that led down into the curved chamber below. The child followed, small hands gripping the railing, eyes wide but quiet, and when he reached the bottom, he looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels different," he said. Daniel heard it, though he did not respond, because some truths did not need to be explained. They needed to be felt. Carter came next, his movements controlled, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the shift in him now, the way his shoulders had lowered, the way his eyes no longer searched for flaws but for reassurance. And as he stepped down into the space beneath the cabin, he paused for a brief second, his hand brushing along the curved support beam, feeling the strength in something he had once dismissed. More followed, filling the chamber slowly, the space accommodating them in a way that did not feel crowded, the arch above distributing weight, holding steady as the world outside continued to shift in ways no one here could fully see. Rex remained at the top of the steps, his gaze fixed outward through the open door, his body still, listening, always listening, and Daniel stood beside him for a moment longer, looking out across the valley where the last of the light had faded into something darker, heavier, the outlines of homes no longer sharp, but uncertain against the horizon. A distant sound rolled through the ground again, deeper this time, longer, and Daniel knew they were. Past the point of waiting, he reached for the door and closed it gently, not with force, not with urgency, but with intention, sealing the space not from the world, but from what the world had become. The latch settled into place with a soft click, final, quiet, and then he turned and stepped down into the chamber, pulling the panel closed above them. The difference was immediate, not silence, but a different kind of sound, muted, distant, the outside world reduced to a low, indistinct presence that no longer pressed directly against them. The lantern light filled the space fully now, warm and steady, casting soft shadows along the curved beams, and for a moment, no one spoke. They simply stood, or sat, or leaned against the structure, their breathing slowing, their bodies beginning to understand what their minds had not yet caught up to. Carter exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his voice quieter when it finally came. "You knew," he said, not accusing, not demanding, just stating what had become impossible to ignore. Daniel met his gaze across the small space, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his eyes now, not distance, not detachment, but a quiet acknowledgement. "I listened," he replied. Carter nodded once, the motion small, but filled with something heavier than agreement, something closer to realization, and he looked around again, this time not at the shape of the place, but at the purpose behind it, at the choices that had led to its design. Above them, the ground shifted again, stronger now, the sound deeper, rolling. But here, beneath the arch, it passed through without breaking anything, without tearing, without fear taking hold. And for the first time since the day began, the people of Pine Hollow were not looking for something to hold on to. They had already found it. Time did not pass the same way beneath the curved beams. It slowed, stretched, softened at the edges, and for a while no one could tell if minutes or hours had slipped by, only that the world above continued to move in distant, muted ways while down here something steadier held. The lantern burned without flicker, its light settling into every corner as if it had always belonged, and the low, rhythmic sounds from outside came and went like a tide that never quite reached them. Rex lay near the base of the steps now, not asleep, never fully asleep, but resting in that quiet readiness that had carried him through places no one else in this room could imagine, his ears lifting slightly each time the ground whispered, then easing again when the sound passed without consequence. Daniel remained standing for a long time, one hand resting lightly against a support beam, feeling the subtle shifts as they traveled through the structure, measuring them not with fear, but with familiarity, the way a man listens to something he has learned to understand without needing to name it. Across from him, Carter Blake sat on a low wooden crate, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders lowered in a way that suggested something inside him had finally let go. And for a long moment, he simply watched the curve of the ceiling above, following its line from one side to the other, as if trying to trace the logic behind it. It should not work, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Daniel heard him anyway. It does, he replied, not as a correction, but as a fact. The child who had spoken earlier now sat close to his mother, his small hand resting gently against the wooden beam beside him, his fingers tracing the grain as if it were something alive, something worth understanding. It feels like it is holding us, he whispered, and his mother looked at him, her expression softening in a way that had nothing to do with the storm above and everything to do with what they had found below. Another low shift passed through the ground, longer this time, but still controlled, still absorbed, and instead of flinching, the people in the room remained still, their bodies beginning to trust what their instincts had once resisted. Carter exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward Daniel again, and there was no trace left of the man who had once stood on a polished deck and laughed at a crooked roof. "I thought you did not know what you were doing," he said, the words steady, stripped of defensiveness, carrying only the weight of recognition. Daniel did not look away. "Most people did," he answered. Carter nodded once, the motion small, but complete, and for a moment, silence settled again, not empty, but full, like something had shifted inside the room that had nothing to do with the earth above. Rex lifted his head then, just slightly, his gaze moving from Daniel to the others, then back again, as if confirming something unseen had aligned, and he let out a slow breath, the tension easing from his body in a way that had not happened since the first shift of the ground. Above them, the sounds began to change, not disappearing, but losing their edge, the sharpness fading into something more distant, more contained, and Daniel felt it immediately, the way the pressure in the air began to release, not all at once, but gradually, like a storm that had decided to move on rather than settle in. He closed his eyes briefly, listening, and when he opened them again, there was a quiet certainty there that had not been spoken aloud. "It is passing," he said, and no one questioned it. They did not need to. They could feel it too. The woman tightened her hold on her child, not out of fear now, but out of relief, and Carter leaned back slightly, his hand still resting against the curved beam, no longer testing it, but trusting it. Time moved again then, gently, steadily, and the room seemed to breathe with it, the shared space no longer defined by who had come from where, but by what had been endured together. Daniel stepped toward the center of the chamber, his movements unhurried, and Rex rose quietly to follow, staying close, always close, as if the bond between them was the one thing that had never needed to change. No one spoke for a while after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments asked for silence, for the space to let understanding settle without interruption, and in that quiet, something deeper than fear, deeper than pride, began to take root. Not victory, Not even relief. Something softer. Something earned. When the final movement faded, it did not end with a sound, but with the absence of one. A quiet so complete it felt unfamiliar, like the world had paused to catch its breath after remembering how fragile it could be. And for a long moment no one in the chamber moved, not because they were afraid, but because they were listening for something that no longer came. Daniel was the first to shift, his head tilting slightly as he measured the silence the same way he had measured the warning, not with hope, but with certainty. And when he finally stepped toward the wooden panel above, Rex rose with him, his body calm now, the tension that had once defined his posture replaced with a steady ease that only came when the danger had truly passed. Daniel reached up and pressed against the seam, the panel giving way with the same quiet click as before, and a thin line of light slipped down into the chamber, soft, pale, carrying with it the scent of dust and open air, unchanged, but somehow different. He climbed first, his movements deliberate, then turned to offer a hand to the woman and her child, helping them up without a word, one by one until the chamber emptied and the group stood again inside the curved cabin, the lantern still burning, though it no longer felt necessary. The air inside had shifted, lighter now, and through the open doorway, the valley stretched out in a way none of them had expected. The ground had settled, but not everything had returned to what it was. Some of the straight-edged homes along the ridge leaned at subtle angles, not broken, but no longer perfect, their sharp lines softened by the quiet reminder that certainty is not the same as strength. Carter stepped slowly onto the porch, his gaze moving across the valley he had once understood so clearly, and for the first time, he did not look at what was wrong, but at what remained. Behind him, others followed, their steps cautious at first, then steadier as they realized the ground beneath them was no longer shifting, that the world had not ended, only changed. The child walked ahead of his mother, his eyes wide, not with fear now, but with wonder, and he stopped just beside Rex, looking up at the dog with a small, uncertain smile. Rex lowered his head slightly, meeting the child at eye level, and after a brief hesitation, the boy reached out, his hand resting gently against the thick fur along Rex's neck, the contact simple, quiet, but filled with something that did not need words. Daniel stood just behind them, watching the valley, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as it had been before any of this began, and Carter turned toward him slowly, the weight of what had happened settling into his expression in a way that stripped away everything unnecessary. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, the words failing to form, not because they were not there, but because none of them felt enough. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, the gesture small, almost imperceptible, but complete in a way no apology could match. Daniel saw it, acknowledged it with nothing more than a quiet look, and then turned his gaze back toward the horizon where the light had begun to return, soft and steady, spreading across the valley without urgency, without force, just enough to reveal what had been there all along. The cabin stood behind them, unchanged, its curved lines catching the morning light in a way that no longer seemed strange, only right, and Rex stepped forward, settling beside Daniel once more, his body relaxed, his eyes calm, as if the world had simply returned to the way it was always meant to be. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths arrive quietly, and once they do not need to be explained. Morning did not rush into Pine Hollow. It arrived slowly, like a quiet promise kept, the light stretching gently across the valley, as if careful not to disturb what had just been endured, and for a long moment, no one moved from where they stood on that uneven ground, because what they were looking at was not just the place they knew, but the truth beneath it. The houses still stood, most of them, but something had shifted in the way they were seen, the sharp edges no longer symbols of certainty, but reminders of how easily certainty can bend when the ground decides otherwise. Carter Blake remained near the porch, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture no longer defined by ownership, but by something quieter, something earned in the hours he had spent beneath a roof he once dismissed. He looked at Daniel again, not searching this time, not questioning, just seeing, really seeing, perhaps for the first time, and the silence between them carried no tension now, only understanding. "I built everything to look strong," Carter said finally, his voice steady but softer than it had ever been, as if each word had been weighed before it was spoken. He glanced out toward his house, its clean lines now slightly off, its perfection quietly undone. But I never thought about what happens when the ground changes. Daniel followed his gaze, his expression calm, unchanged, and for a moment, the distance between them was measured not in steps, but in experience. Strength is not how something stands, Daniel said quietly. It is how it moves when it has to. Carter nodded slowly, the words settling deeper than any explanation ever could, and he let out a breath that seemed to carry more than just relief, something closer to release, as if he had finally let go of a version of himself that no longer fit the world he had just witnessed. Nearby, the others began to move again, not in panic, not in urgency, but in careful, deliberate steps, checking on one another, calling names softly, their voices no longer sharp, but grounded, and the woman who had held her child so tightly now loosened her grip just enough for him to step forward again. The boy walked back toward Rex, his small hand reaching out once more confident this time, and when his fingers brushed against the dog's fur, he smiled, not wide, not loud, but real, the kind of smile that comes from feeling safe without needing to be told why. Rex leaned into the touch slightly, his eyes calm, his presence steady as ever, and Daniel watched the moment without interruption, because some connections are not meant to be guided, only allowed. The wind moved through the valley again, softer now, carrying with it the scent of earth and wood and something clean, something new, and as it curved around the cabin, it no longer felt strange, only right, as if the land itself had acknowledged the shape that had once been misunderstood. Carter took a step closer to Daniel, then stopped, not out of hesitation, but respect, and for a second, it seemed like he might say something more, something that would tie everything together into a single, clear meaning, but instead, he simply extended his hand. Not as a transaction, not as a formality, as recognition. Daniel looked at it briefly, then met Carter's eyes, and in that quiet exchange, something passed between them that did not need words, did not need explanation, only acceptance. He reached out and took the hand, the gesture firm, simple, complete, and when they released, nothing needed to be added. Around them, Pine Hollow began to breathe again, not as it had before, but as something changed, something aware, and the curved cabin stood at the edge of it all, not as a symbol of difference, but as a reminder, quiet and steady, that what looks broken is not always weak, and what stands alone is not always wrong. Daniel stepped back slightly, Rex moving with him, their silhouettes framed by the morning light, and for a brief second, the world seemed to settle into stillness, not the silence of uncertainty, but the kind that comes after something has been understood. No one laughed now. No one turned away. And as the sun rose fully over Pine Hollow, it did not reveal victory or loss, but something softer, something lasting, something that could not be built in straight lines, only lived.